Good morning and welcome to this session on fiscal policy. I am Neelam Jha, ex-Chief Manager, Faculty, Central Bank of India. So, what is fiscal policy? Let's begin with that. In simple words, it is the guiding force that helps governments to decide how much money is required to support the economic activities and what should be the target of revenue it needs to earn from the system so as to keep the wheels of the economy running smoothly. See, mercurial economic systems, galloping inflation, unsustainable debt levels and volatility in exchange rates and financial markets can endanger the national growth story, and hence the tools of fiscal policy are used for macroeconomic stabilization. Now, macroeconomic stability rests on key economic relationships like domestic demand and output, the balance of payments, fiscal revenues and expenditure, and savings and investment, all being in sync, right? But while it may be relatively easy to identify a country in a state of macroeconomic instability, or for that matter stability, there is a substantial indeterminate territory in between where countries enjoy a degree of stability, but there is scope of improvement in macroeconomic performance. So, how do we identify macroeconomic instability? Where countries' large current account deficits are being financed by short-term borrowing, there is high and rising levels of public debt, then there is double-digit inflation and stagnant or declining GDP, right? These all are parameters of macroeconomic instability. And similarly, when there is a current account and fiscal balances consistent with low and declining debt levels, inflation is in single low digits, and rising per capita GDP, they all are symptoms of stability. So, the governments use the instruments of taxation and government spending to influence the economic growth. Fiscal policy is an important constituent of the overall economic framework of a country and is intimately linked with its general economic policy strategy. It deals with the taxation and expenditure decisions of the government and is composed of several parts like tax policy, expenditure policy, investment or disinvestment strategies, and debt or surplus management. So, how does it work? An effective fiscal policy is important to control inflation, increase employment, and maintain the value of money. To counter the vicious cycle of lean growth, lower production, and lower demand, the government's fiscal policy initiatives aim at increasing spending to tide over the falling private sector investment and to create demand in the market. And to incentivize spending, the government may choose tax cuts as a measure. It could also increase its spending in the form of welfare, pension, etc., which increases the purchasing power of the people at large. Fiscal policy that increases the aggregate demand directly through an increase in the government spending is typically called expansionary. In contrast, fiscal policy is considered contractionary if it reduces demand via lower spending. Fiscal policy can put the economy on a sounder long-term footing through investment in infrastructure, healthcare, and education, through fair distribution of incomes and opportunities, through an equitable tax and transfer system, and provision of basic public services. The drivers can be developmental levels, demographics, or natural resource endowments. An effective fiscal policy will inevitably raise the confidence of the private investors, who in turn will be encouraged to expand, bringing in investment and driving demand. Now let's take up the whys and hows in fiscal policy. It has a direct impact on the common man, both through government's overall fiscal stance and through the distributional implications of tax policy and public spending. Structural fiscal reforms in budget, public administration and accountability benefits the common man in terms of more efficient and better targeted use of public resources. Please note that fiscal policy feeds into the economic trends and influences the monetary policy. When the government receives more than it spends, it has a surplus, which is a rarity. But more often than not, the government spends more than it receives, then it runs a deficit, and to meet this deficit, it may borrow from domestic or foreign resources. It can draw upon its foreign exchange reserves, or it can print an equivalent amount of money. But all this tends to influence other economic variables like on a broad generalization, excessive printing of money leads to inflation. Then if the governmental external borrowings rise too much, it can lead to a debt crisis. And if it draws down on its foreign exchange reserves, a balance of payment crisis may arise. Most importantly, if there is excessive domestic borrowing by the government, it may lead to higher real interest rates, and the domestic private sector will find it difficult to access funds, resulting in the crowding out of private investment. These are not standalone possibilities. Sometimes a combination of these can occur. We all know that the impact of a large deficit on a long-run growth and economic well-being is negative. Therefore, it is not prudent for a government to run an unduly large deficit for a long period. The key challenge for government is to meet infrastructure and social needs while managing the government's finances in a way that the deficit or the accumulating debt burden is not too great. The fiscal policy of the government influences the economy by changing the level and types of taxes, the extent and composition of spending, and the degree and form of borrowing. Right? Government directly and indirectly influences the way resources are used in the economy. Let's understand it. If we look at the basic equation of national income accounting that measures the output of economy, that is GDP, according to expenditures, it says GDP, that is the value of all final goods and services produced in the economy, is equal to C, private consumption, plus I, private investment, plus G, purchase of goods and services by the government, plus NX, that is net exports, exports minus imports. So in an equation, we would write it as GDP is equal to C plus I plus G plus NX. Now this equation clearly shows the government's role in affecting the economic activity by controlling G directly, that is government spending, and influencing C, I and NX, that is consumption, investment and net import, exports indirectly through changes in taxes, transfers and spending. Coming to the importance of fiscal policy in India, in a country like ours, fiscal policy plays a key role in elevating the rate of capital formation. Through taxation, the fiscal policy helps to mobilize a considerable amount of resources for financing the numerous projects. It also helps in providing stimulus to elevate the savings rate. It gives adequate incentives to the private sector to expand its activities. And last but not the least, fiscal policy aims to minimize the imbalance in the dispersal of income and wealth. Governments typically use fiscal policies, governmental spending and taxation tools to promote strong and sustainable growth and reduce poverty. So far, so easy, right? Not so. Here is the catch-22 for the policymakers. How much control should they have in economic matters of the nation as well as its citizens? Too much or too less may choke the breathing space of the economy. Although the fiscal policy is an effective tool to manage the economy, sometimes factors other than economic requirements take center stage. Politics of populism in the form of grants, subsidies, freebies, and other financial stimuli that are hard to roll back creates unnecessary pressures on the economy. The governments are forced to fund this deficit by diverting resources from other areas. Raising tax is an unpopular choice when considered from a political angle. To mitigate that, the government may have to resort to curtailing government spending while keeping the tax rates intact and unchanged. Populist measures sometimes clash, and choosing one over the other or finding a middle path is not that easy. Hence, tax policy should aim at moving towards a system of easily administered taxes with broader base and moderate marginal rates, to the extent that some revenue provisions may be regressive. They should be offset through the expenditure system, that is, transitory, well-targeted food subsidies could offset the adverse impact of adjustment policies on the poor. Thus, implementing optimum checks and finding the right balance is the key to a prudent fiscal policy. That's all for this session. Thank you all. Namaskar.